Good to see you. Very good morning to everybody this morning. Everybody's making their way in. Yeah, they're making their way into the auditorium. Glad to have you on the live stream with us this morning. We're getting settled here in the auditorium, so it's a good thing. Good to have each and every one of you here this morning. It is good to get up in the morning. A nice, crisp, cool morning. All right. If you want to go ahead and open your Bibles to Mark, we're going to be in Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. We're going to start in Mark 14. We're going to be in several different books this morning. Once again, good morning to everyone this morning. A little bit different this morning with this cool weather and everything. It's kind of adjusting. It's been so hot for so long, and now finally we get some cooler weather. Don't know how to behave almost. So we're glad to have you here with us. Glad to have you with us on the live stream as well. Want to invite you to Margaret Street Church of Christ, our worship service. Both our Bible study and our worship service is now open to the public. All services are open, including our Bible classes. We do have a special designated area for high risk and for mask only. Here in one section of the pews has been roped off for that, and the balcony has been designated as mask only. And please wear a mask if you sit in the balcony. But we want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable coming and being able to participate in worship. Now that we are moving into phase 3 and beyond, according to Florida law and directions, then we can certainly start to move about more and coming to services and things like that. All right, this morning we are continuing our study of the life of Christ. We are studying a chronological study of the various events in the life of Christ. We are in the last week of the life of Christ. We are currently in Thursday. If you break it down to the various days, we are and have been now Thursday. There's a lot that's taking place, and there's so much that's taking place that sometimes at this point it can get a little bit difficult to make sense of it all as you're studying chronologically. How many of you have ever seen a movie where there were about 4 or 5 different plot lines going on at the same time, and they all culminate into one main point, right? And what does that movie do? Typically, it will back up, or it'll start at one point and show you one of those plot lines, and then it'll segue to another plot line, but it needs to back up in time to the same time that this one started to be able to tell you what's going on. And then it'll continue that, and sometimes it'll go back and forth, in and out of the different plot lines. Well, that is exactly what's happening in the life of Christ at this point. And so, as you see on the chart right here, this harmony of the gospel accounts, we have taken these events, and I'm not the first one to do this. There's all kinds of these harmony of the gospel account lists that are out there. This particular one is available at our website, and it is 260 events, and they are put in a specific order. But as you can see on this one, number 212, you see that Jesus sat down with his disciples for supper. And then you see Jesus washes his feet, number 213, washes the feet of the disciples after supper. You continue reading and it says Jesus announces one will betray. Jesus and disciples celebrate Last Supper. Well, wait a minute. What is it? Did they celebrate the Last Supper, or does he wash their feet after supper? What happens is, as you can see there, because of the way that each of the Bible accounts tells the story, sometimes they'll get out of chronological order. All right, so John does not tell, if you see there, it's looking in John chapter 13, which is one of the places we're going to go today. John does not tell the story in exact order. He kind of moves around a little bit depending on the theme or what he's trying to teach. Matthew is the same way. He does not follow perfectly a chronological order. Luke, on the other hand, typically follows mostly chronological. So, as I said, that idea of this movie and these different parts, Well, what's going to happen right here is we're going to have to jump ahead and go back and move around a little bit in these different spots so that you can see and understand what's happening, okay? So keep that in mind as we begin in Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, what we're going to deal with is essentially where we are on this Thursday partaking of this meal of the Last Supper. Now, last week we talked about this. If you will advance 2 more slides for me, please. One more slide. Sorry, I didn't realize I had so many. So last week we talked about how this is more likely the scenario that this Lord's Supper took place in. Okay, this is more the scenario, and today we're really going to see that, and that's because of the moment that we've come to now, and that is that Jesus announces that one will betray him. And there's a lot of things that are going on here that all have to do with this particular setting, as well as just mentioned about the different timeline. Okay, so 2 things to keep in mind: this setting and then a timeline where we're going to have to back up and look forward and things like that. So let's begin in Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, verse 17 is what I have here. Yes. All right. Mark chapter 14, verse 17. In the evening he came with the 12. Now as they sat and ate, Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you, one of you who eats with me will betray me." And they began to be sorrowful and say to him one by one, "Is it I?" And another said, "Is it I?" Then he answered and said to them, It is one of the 12 who dips with me in the dish. The Son of Man indeed goes just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had never been born. All right, so that's the first one, and as we've mentioned several times here, the thing about a chronological study is you need to look at all the different passages to put the whole picture together. So now we're going to go to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22 gives us a little more information, and then we'll go to Matthew's account. Luke chapter 22, around verse 14. All right, just so you have your context, in verse 14, and when the hour had come, he sat down with the 12 apostles with him. Now jump with me to verse 21, because we've already talked about the Lord's Supper itself. So now we're jumping to 21, and this gives you an idea now, where are we in the chronology? So Jesus has already offered up the cup, he's already offered up the bread, and instituted the Lord's Supper. All right, there in verse 20, you see that, the new covenant in my blood. Then, in verse 21, but behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. And truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. Then they began to question among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing. All right, so there Luke gives you a little bit more information. So now we see this picture starting to unravel. Let's go with me now to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. Beginning in verse 21. Matthew 26, verse 21. Now, as they were eating, he said, "Assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and each of them began to say to him, "Lord, is it I?" Then he answered and said, "He who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." Then Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, "Rabbi, is it I?" And he said to him, "You have said it." And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then you see there the Lord's Supper. And so right there, immediately, if you're paying real close attention, you notice that Luke put that part before, and then Matthew does it after. All right, so what do we have here? So what's going on? He's here saying, take, eat of my body, drink of it. Then the cup gave thanks. This goes back partially to what we were talking about, that there's more than one cup. And so the timing on that sometimes is a question. The point is you're seeing this picture of all these men sitting around, and here Jesus in the middle of this supper that he says in Luke chapter 22, I have fervently desired to eat this with you, now is announcing that one will betray him. All right, so everybody sees the picture, starting to get this together. Now, notice that Mark said, we'll point out a few things in these verses first, and then we'll move on to completing the picture. Notice one of the things that Mark said. In Mark chapter 14, verse 20 that we read a minute ago, he said, one of the 12 will betray him. You know, we often forget, when we think about Judas, we often forget Judas was one of the 12 disciples that Jesus Christ himself chose. Judas didn't just join up with this merry band of disciples. Judas was chosen. You remember the account of Jesus walking along the sea, and he came upon Simon and his brother Andrew. He came upon John and James, and he said what to them? What did he say to them? You know the answer. Follow me, right? And I'll make you fishers of men. He walked up to Matthew, the Levite, the tax collector, and said, what? Come follow me. So we don't have this account in the Scriptures, but somewhere in the story of Jesus Christ, Jesus walked up to Judas, or was talking to Judas, and said, come, follow me. Have you ever thought about that? Judas Iscariot. You know, when we think of Judas Iscariot, that's automatically we assign a connotation in our mind, right? Bad Judas, right? It's like when we say Jezebel or something like that, bad. But we forget Judas was one of the disciples. He was one of those who was right there with Jesus. He heard all the teaching. He also was sent out on the limited commission. He went out and was preaching the gospel to those Jews that Jesus sent them out to. He was probably even healing people and doing or some sort of miraculous event to confirm the word, just like all the other disciples. You know, Judas was right there with the loaves of fishes and the bread, gathering those up and passing those out, being a servant in that regard. We forget that a lot of times when we think about Judas. And so that little phrase, one of the 12, not somebody on the outside circle. You know, there's a lot of other people that are outside his circle. Not one of them, one of his very own in the inner circle. All right, 12 disciples. One of those will betray him. Now that's sad. And then in Matthew, notice whenever he is asked, well, who's it going to be, Lord? Notice they're all sorrowful. That's important. They're all very sorrowful. Like they understand when Jesus predicts something, it's going to come true. And here he's saying this, and when he says it's one of you 12, they become sorrowful because they know God's power. They know Jesus' power. And I would be sad too, wouldn't you, if Jesus looked at this crowd right here and said, one of you will fall away. Wouldn't you be sorrowful? A, you'd be sorrowful, hopefully it's not you. B, you should be sorrowful for the fact that one of our brethren are going to fall away. You know, do you ever think about that? Why else would they be sorrowful? Even if it's not them, they should be sorrowful that one of their own is going to betray their Lord and Master. Isn't that a terrible thing? Of course we should be sorrowful. I'm reminded of Samuel. You remember Samuel the prophet? And what was his job? His job was a spokesperson for God to Saul. He was there and went and anointed Saul king on God's command. And then whenever Saul disobeyed, which by the way is a preview for the sermon today, when Saul disobeyed, you see Samuel mourned for Saul. It hurt him that God's anointed was the kingdom was taken from him. And that's the way we should be. Whenever we have a brother that falls away or there's a problem or something like that, it should hurt us. Do we think that way sometimes? You see, there's a lot of application here. Now, he says, who's it going to be? And he says, that he who dips his bread. You know that word dip there is based on the word baptized. And this helps us understand right there in this context of what the word baptized means. You know, he didn't say, he who I sprinkle, or who I pour, right? No, he said dip. What does that show? It shows immersion, going down. So it shows a way that we can understand words, but there's more to it than that. You see, in Middle Eastern culture, this was very common to have, and it still is today, to have a kind of a sauce or I call it a sauce. It's some type of liquid, and it's very common to have that in the middle of the table, and people would take bread. I see this even down in South America, take bread and dip it in there and eat it. So if you're dipping here, somebody across the table's dipping, everybody's dipping into it. What does that say about intimacy, right? We're all sharing the same. Now, I know that sounds kind of weird in COVID times, doesn't it? But this is the way before that. But they're all dipping in there, so he's saying he who dips. See, that's significant. That's culturally significant. In other words, this is somebody close to me. And to betray that is the worst of betrayals. You know, this is part of their culture. So there's, again, so many significant things within the Scriptures that talks about all this. Now he says, we saw 3 times that he says, as the Son of Man goes. So here he is giving this prediction. He's here talking about how he's going to be betrayed. Well, the other reason that the disciples should be sorrowful, because they know the Scriptures also. And they would know in Psalm 41, verse 9. Go with me there. Keep your finger here in Matthew, and go with me to Psalm 41, verse 9. This is what he's bringing to mind. So there are prophecies about the Messiah, all kinds of prophecies about the Messiah, but then here's one specific about the betrayer. Psalm 41, verse 9. Even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. Isn't that powerful? So a friend, one that I trusted. This is Jesus saying, he who dipped bread with me. And then he goes on to say this prophecy or fulfillment of prophecy. It means that it was somebody close, trusted, and to raise your heel. I mean, you think about that. You know the old phrase, have you ever heard that phrase, kick them in the teeth when they're down? Have you ever heard that phrase? Maybe it's just a Texas thing. I see Brett shaking his head. It's a bad phrase, but it just shows to add insult to injury even more, maybe more injury to injury. That's what this means by raising the heel, that while you're down, you're going to raise your heel against them. How terrible, right? It is. It is. You're absolutely right, Gail. And so, what we see here is this close, trusted friend of Jesus is going to betray him. Now, does that mean, before we go any further, does that mean that Judas had no control over his actions? Just because it's prophesied right here, and God knew it was going to happen. God could look in the future and see this is going to happen. Jesus recognizes that, being God on earth, for seeing it fulfilled, and he even sees, we're going to get real in depth in just a second here with this interaction between Jesus and Judas. But even though all that happened, did Judas have no control over his actions? Was he just a player in the game of chess of God's scheme of redemption? You're on it. You're on it. He had a weakness.
Jesus didn't say, God's going to make somebody among you do this. He said,
One of you is going to do it. That's a great point, Paul. I'm going to repeat that. Jesus did not say, God is going to make one of you do this. He said, one of you is going to do this. In other words, you what? Choose. Yeah. Do you parents who know your children well, all right, can you fairly well predict what they're going to do in certain situations? Every single head is shaking yes. You can pretty well predict in certain situations. I'll just give you one. That was my weakness. If Mom left a candy jar out here in the middle of the room, she could pretty well count on the fact that I was going to sneak over there and get one of those, right? What? Well, God can do that beyond, because He's omniscient, He's omnipresent, and He's omnipotent. All right, so He can see these things, and Jesus is God on earth. He can see these things. Now, so what we have here is Jesus saying that someone's going to betray. And in this account here in Matthew, where we are in Matthew, notice this exchange. We're about to elaborate on this a little bit more, but notice this exchange between Jesus and Judas. Then Judas, who was betraying Him, this is Matthew's commentary, letting you know it is Judas, by the way, if you haven't figured it out yet. That's kind of Matthew's way of saying that. Answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? And Jesus said, you have said it. It is, another way of saying this is, it is as you have said. In other words, He acknowledges it. He acknowledges, Judas, you are fulfilling the prophecy. So,
Jesus was trying to find out if He knew it was Him.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, put yourself in Judas's shoes. Is he thinking, does Jesus know about my deal with the Pharisees? Because what's in the pocket of Judas at this time?
His face probably got red.
What?
His face probably got red.
I know mine would get red, that's for sure. He's probably got the 30 pieces of silver in his pocket sitting right there at the table, right? Now, I hope none of you have been in a situation like that of whatever it is, say embezzlement or some kind of, you better not have been, hopefully, any criminal activity. But whenever you start to be found out, okay, I can tell you, unfortunately, it is not a good feeling. I didn't do any bad criminal things, but I have been caught. I remember I've told you before, I didn't live my life always as a Christian. I fell away from the church. And during that time, I did some worldly things, and I got in trouble for them. All right, so it's not a good feeling. Now, I can't even begin to imagine what Judas must be feeling. So he knew he was doing something. Jesus acknowledges it. And I also find it interesting that Judas says, is it I? Almost as if, I'm going to go a different direction here, almost as if, like, how could it possibly be me? Isn't that the case sometimes when it comes to our own sin? We don't recognize sometimes our own sin. Other people might be able to see it, even if we continue in it, because you got to realize that this is Judas in a further advanced state. Again, we're going to talk about this more in just a second when we go to John. In a more advanced state of the sin, it didn't just wake up on this day and go, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to just betray the Son of Man and everything and go get this money. It was a buildup, remember? Because remember earlier it talked about how he used to take money out of the purse for himself, all right? This is not his first sin. It's a buildup. And then we also don't know what was the thinking behind Judas going to the Pharisees. Some people have speculated that it's a possibility that Judas thought he's going to speed up the process. Jesus keeps talking about becoming the Messiah. He's going to be the king and everything. Let's speed up the process. There's all this bantering going back and forth. It's like, let's just go ahead and get the fight on, okay? So maybe this is his way of doing it. Or there's all kinds of things you could think about. It's all conjecture, but we don't know what was in the mind of Judas. But what we do know is that Satan was involved, right? So, let's go a little bit deeper into this. Now that we've talked about all this, and let's look at another picture that John paints. Go with me to John chapter 13. John chapter 13. Now remember a moment ago, I told you this is like a movie where we gave you a scenario and everything, and now we need to jump back and stuff. If you go to John chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, you see there it comes up to the supper, all right, the Lord's Supper. And in verse 2 it says, supper being ended, Jesus gets up and washes the disciples' feet. We still have yet to discuss that, to talk about that. But see, that's kind of out of order with what's happening right now. So John's jumped ahead in time, but let's back up and stay with the same time frame we've been at and plug John into this same picture here and see what he has to say. So that means we need to jump up to verse 21. Does everybody understand what I just did? When we're talking about chronology, that's why I gave you the idea of that movie, of the different things going on. So what we're doing is we're going to set John chapter 13, 1 through 20 aside for just a moment, okay? And we're going to jump in time to this same time we've been talking about with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we're going to look in verse 21. When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. You see now where we are in the timeline? Everybody's with me? We've got them all lined up now, right? Then the disciples looked at one another perplexed about whom he spoke. Now, in other versions of the story, we've been reading about how they were sorrowful, right? So there's two emotions now that have been pointed out. Perplexed and sorrowful. They're sad and they're confused because they're thinking, how could this be? But they're sad at the same time. Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. This gives us this picture that I have here on the screen of them reclining on the left, okay? So they're all reclining there, and it says, leaning on Jesus' bosom. If I'm leaning on my left, where's my bosom? Right here, right? That means where's the one whom Jesus loves, which by the way is John. John likes to describe himself as that. The one whom Jesus loves. I love that. Where would John be? Right here, right? He'd be able to lean back into Jesus' bosom. If you're laying at a table like that, see those guys at the table? Like for example, look at this guy in the blue turban right here. He could lean right back into that guy's chest. Or the one over here. You see how each one of them can lean back? So, that's John is right there. So Jesus being at the head of the table, that means John is right in front of Jesus. Simon Peter, I love this. This is one of my favorite little exchanges, a human exchange. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was whom he spoke. So I want you to imagine, as you see right here, all right, this one on the right, you see Jesus there in the middle. The one on the right, that would be John. Okay, John's in Jesus' bosom. Let's say we don't believe Peter is sitting right there next to Jesus, because I'm going to tell you who's sitting next to him in just a second. Peter's maybe across the table. And look at this. Can you imagine Peter hearing this? And yet remember the inner three is who? Peter, James, and John. Those three, right? They're really close. They've been through a few more things together than all the other disciples. And Peter's sitting there and he looks over at John and he goes, can you imagine that? You see that little exchange, that human exchange sitting at this dinner table? Here's this grand moment, and meanwhile, you know how movies do that too. They'll zoom in and you'll see that. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him, like, ask him. Who's he talking about? Who it was whom he spoke. Then, leaning back on Jesus' breast. Now here we go again. Here's John, right? And said to him, Lord, who is it? So here's Jesus eating. He says, one of you will betray me. Peter, meanwhile, motions to John, and John's like, okay. And so John leans back and asks Jesus, who is it, Lord? Right there, if I get right over here, let's say I didn't have a microphone on where everybody can hear me and I could just whisper to him, you wouldn't hear everything that Steve and I are talking about, right? That's what's going on. John asked Jesus, Lord, who is it? Now they're close, right? This is the inner three. Jesus answered, it is he whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. There again is that same thing that Matthew said, right? Matthew told this same account, that it's going to be he who I dipped the bread with. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now, remember what I said? That in the middle of the table, there's this sauce, this soup, or whatever it is, this liquid that they're dipping the bread in. So here's Jesus leaning over the table. John leans back and real intimately says, Lord, who is it? Jesus takes a piece of bread and he says, it's he who dips the bread. And dips the bread. Now, if he did this, here, Simon, or here, James, or reach it across the table, that'd be pretty obvious, wouldn't it? Everybody would see that and know that. So, as we continue reading, and I'll come back to this in just a second, look what happens. He gives it to Judas. Now, after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. But no one at the table knew for what reason he had said this to him. So what's going on? Here's John, leans back. Who is it, Lord? Jesus takes the bread, and he says, it's to him that I dipped this. He dips it, and all he'd have to do is turn around and give it to Judas right here. That means Judas is at his back. Right there, you see him? Now look at that. Isn't that interesting? What's that guy doing? Is it I, Lord? Isn't that what we read earlier? And so Jesus just has to look back at him and say, what you do, do quickly. Right? Right here, just this little instrument. Now another thing about the person sitting at the back of Jesus, the host of the table, that's the most trusted spot. We've talked about this before. That spot is the most trusted. Why? Because you're giving your back to him. What could somebody sitting back here at Jesus' back do? Right? Yeah. I mean, think of Caesar, right? Et tu, Brutus?
Guard your back.
Guard your back. That might be where that comes from, Joey. So the point being is, there's that intimate exchange. All right, so John has an intimate exchange with him. Judas has an intimate exchange with him. And what does the psalm say? A friend whom I trusted. You see how the Bible fits together so beautifully, harmoniously, that even in the Psalms, written 1,000 years before, almost 1,000 years before, identifies this moment down to the T, that somebody like Judas, who was in the most trusted position, not only was he at Jesus' back, but he carried all the money. You don't give the money to just anybody, right? You give the money to somebody you trust. And so here we have Judas acknowledging this. Now, there's some more things that are happening right here. It says that after he gave him the piece of bread, Satan entered him. All right, don't overread. Make sure you think about what's happening. Is this the first time that Satan has entered Jesus? Just right here, go back in Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. Keep your finger here. But in Luke chapter 22, verses 3 and 4, it says, then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he went his way and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them. And right here in John, back in chapter 12, verse 6, there's that verse that says, when John was explaining, he said that Judas got upset. He said this not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. And he had the money box and used to take what was put in it. So is this the first time Satan has entered into Judas? No. See what I meant earlier? This is how sin works. Nobody typically wakes up and just, boom, all of a sudden does this heinous act, whatever it is, murder, adultery, theft, or whatever it is. It's usually little things that build up. It's like cancer. It takes control, and it eventually completely metastasizes to the point that your entire body is full of sin. Up to this point, Judas had control over himself. But there comes a point where you allow sin to fester and grow so much that eventually you're just given over to Satan. Doesn't the Bible teach that?
That's when your heart becomes hardened.
That's when your heart becomes hardened, and that's a great point. Does Satan indwell within us? Thank you. No, he does not. All right, Satan is not. We want to put Satan up on the same level as God or the Spirit. He is not. Remember Job chapter 2, Satan walking upon the face of the earth. Does he have influence over us? Yes, but he does not enter us. Instead, how does he enter us?
He doesn't like us.
He doesn't like us. How does he enter us? He enters us through that influence. Okay? 1 John 2, 15, 16. Through the lust of the flesh, the lust of the... Say it again.
Lust of flesh, lust of the eye, and pride of life.
Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. The three things that Jesus was tempted in Luke 4, Matthew 4. The three things that Eve was tempted in the day that she partook of that tree. All right, so those little things enter in, and they grow, and they become to the point where you're completely consumed with that sin. Thus, Satan entered him.
Wasn't Judas upset when the perfume was poured out?
Yeah, that's the verse that was talking about when he took the money out of the box. All right, so, but no one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. Whenever Jesus says, what you do, do quickly. Isn't that scary to think about? Here's Jesus, what you do, do quickly. Remember, he's God in the flesh. Can he see into the heart of individuals? Does he know? I believe that at this point, see, what we see in Jesus is we see kind of this growing of his deity within him. You know, when Jesus was a young boy, he was a young boy. Now, he was still God in the flesh, but he was a young boy. But you see him when he becomes baptized, that the Spirit descends upon him. Then you see him do miracles, and you see this, it's almost, I don't know how to describe it. It's like his deity grows. The awareness and the in-tuneness of his deity grows and grows. At this point, he is fully aware of every single thing, every single detail of the scheme of redemption that has been in place since before the foundation of the earth, because he is God in the flesh. Does that make sense? He knew he had to do God's will. He knew what the will was before he came. And he knew when he picked Judas. And he knew when he picked Judas. That's a great point. He knew when he picked Judas. Go do what you do quickly. All right? But no one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. For some thought, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus said to him, buy those things we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. All right? So even among the disciples, they didn't suspect Judas. They just got through having a conversation. One of you is going to betray me. And then Judas, you see this interaction between Judas and Jesus, and then Judas gets up and leaves. Nobody said, there he is. He's the one. You notice that? Nobody said that. Nobody thought that. Nobody suspected Judas. Now, when we're reading this, obviously John's giving commentary over and over and over. Judas, the one who betrayed him. Matthew, Judas, the one who betrayed him. Mark, Judas, the one who betrayed him. Luke, Judas, the one who betrayed him. They have the hindsight of 20/20, but they didn't know it in that moment. And so he gets up, and they think he's going to go take care of his son. And then it says, verse 30, having received the piece of bread, then he went out immediately, and it was night. He who I give the bread, he's right here. He can hear Jesus perfectly say that. He dips the bread and gives it to Judas. We don't know what goes through Judas's mind, but wow. I can't even begin to imagine. JC? How many hours went by? Oh, before he was taken in the garden? Okay, so right now, well, first of all, notice it says, and it was night. All right, so this is in the springtime, and if it's like around here, it gets nighttime around 6, 7 o'clock at night. If it's at least 7 o'clock, 7:30 right here, at least. And as we continue to read, as we get over into the Garden of Gethsemane, there's still several hours. It was hours of the morning whenever they come to arrest him, and he's there praying, and the men are sleepy, and we'll talk about that more when we get to that point. But so by the time they eat and everything else, they probably started the meal. This is a guess, is all it is, around 5, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon or something, began this meal. There's probably some Jewish history and Jewish custom that you can look up that will probably tell you specifically when they were to eat it. Good question.
It might be, it probably is really on you. It might be a play on words in the third. The end, and it was night. It's always night.
Ah.
If you give in to your sin, you let sin take you, it's night in your life. So that might not be intended, but I believe probably there's a double meaning there.
Love that. Great point. Yeah, and John does do that. He does put in other teachings and things like that that can be involved there. So great point. So hopefully now you see the overall picture of what's going on. Now, next slide, please. Going back to Matthew, going back to Matthew 26. Now, Matthew's account has this exchange taking place. Judas was betraying him and answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? He said to him, you have said it. And then it says, then they go into the Lord's Supper. There's a few questions that we don't have the answers to because according to John's account, Jesus said this before giving the Lord's Supper. This happened before the Lord's Supper. So did Judas not participate in the Lord's Supper? But then you read here in Matthew, it shows that he did. So there's some questions about the time frame of when did Judas actually get up and leave? It's something interesting to think about. Does it have anything to do with your faith or your salvation, is knowing exactly when Judas got up and left? No, it's just one of those interesting things. And the only reason I point it out is because we were reading, and if you're paying attention, you'll notice there's the Lord's Supper. And then did Judas do this before or after? There's a couple of questions there. We simply don't know. We just know that Judas was there in the upper room. Judas was participating in the meal because clearly he was handing bread to him and things like that. We just don't know when Judas got up. Did he get up before Jesus said, this is the new covenant in my blood? All right, that's the question, but it's just one of those scholarly things that's fun to think about. Any other questions, comments? Well, I was hoping that we would get to the next part, and that is, with all this going on, the disciples are still arguing about who's going to be the greatest. After Jesus just got through saying when he's going to betray me. And then we go from that into the washing of feet, which is a beautiful scene. So we'll pick that up next week when we talk about this idea of being the greatest right after he said, someone will betray me. Once again, any other comments, questions?
How much of a sin was it, a real sin, that Judas went and betrayed him when it was part of the pattern?
Yeah. How much of a sin was it? It was such a bad sin that Judas felt extreme remorse, so much so that he went and hung himself. And so it must have been really bad. All right, thank you for your attention. We're going to take a short break now. We're going to prepare for our worship service.